The coffee was bad. Adrian Mercer had driven 2 hours from a meeting that accomplished nothing, stopped at the first diner he saw off the highway, and ordered coffee that tasted like it had been sitting on the burner since breakfast. He drank it anyway. The place was called Merle's. It sat on the edge of a 2-lane road outside Nashville, the kind of diner that had checkered floors and plastic menus and a rotating pie display by the register. 3 booths were occupied. A trucker sat at the counter eating a burger. Country music played low from somewhere behind the kitchen. Adrian wasn't the type of man people approached without reason. He was broad-shouldered, quiet in the way that made rooms feel smaller, and his reputation in certain circles meant most people gave him space without being told to. He had a way of sitting, completely still, eyes slightly downcast, that most people read as dangerous. Sometimes it was. Tonight, it was just exhaustion. His associate Nolan had texted twice, asking about the meeting outcome. Adrian hadn't replied. The outcome was simple enough. The deal was dead. The other party had been lying for weeks, and Adrian had walked out before things turned into something he'd regret. He was trying to regret fewer things lately. He pulled out his wallet to pay, and that's when it happened. The photograph slipped out from between 2 folded bills and landed face up on the table. It was old, black and white, the edges soft from years of handling. A woman stood in front of a house he no longer recognized. She was smiling at whoever held the camera, her head tilted slightly, her hand raised to block the sun. He'd carried that photograph for so long, he sometimes forgot it was there. He reached for it, but a hand got there first. Not grabbing, just steadying it on the table before it slid to the floor. He looked up. The waitress, her name tag read Brielle, was holding a coffee pot in one hand and had stopped the photograph from falling with 2 fingers of the other. She looked down at it the way people look at something that surprises them, not a casual glance, a real look. "Sorry," she said, starting to pull her hand away. Then she stopped. She looked at the photograph again, more carefully this time, and something shifted in her face. "Can I ask who this is?" she said. Adrian took the photograph back. "Someone I knew." Brielle set the coffee pot down on the table without being asked. She wasn't being intrusive. Her expression wasn't curious in that small, nosy way. She looked like someone trying to work something out. "I'm sorry to bother you," she said quietly. "But that woman in the picture, I think I've seen her." He looked up slowly. "I volunteer at a church shelter in Franklin," Brielle continued. "About a week ago, an elderly woman came in. She stayed 2 nights. She was kind, very private, didn't talk much about herself." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "But she had a photograph. She kept it in her coat pocket, took it out a few times, just to look at it. I noticed because people at the shelter usually don't carry things like that unless it means something." Adrian said nothing. He was listening in that particular way of his, completely still. "I think it was the same woman," Brielle said. "Same face. Older, but the same." "The photograph she carried," he said. "What did it look like?" "Black and white. A woman in front of a house. And she had a newspaper clipping folded up with it." Brielle hesitated. The name on the clipping was Mercer. The diner kept going around them. The trucker finished his burger. The music switched to something slower. Adrian sat with the word Mercer hanging in the air between them, and felt something crack open inside his chest. His mother's name was Evelyn Mercer. She had died when he was 17. He had stood at her funeral in the rain. He had watched the casket lower. He had spent the following years building something from nothing, turning grief into ambition, turning loss into a kind of controlled fury that eventually became an empire. He had not spoken her name out loud in years. "That's not possible," he said. "I know how it sounds," Brielle said. "She passed away. A long time ago." Brielle didn't argue with him. She didn't push. She just looked at him steadily and said, "The woman I met wasn't a ghost. She ate soup and asked me if we had any books she could borrow. She was real." A pause. "I didn't think anything of it until I saw your photograph just now." Adrian looked down at the picture in his hand. He had carried it so long he could reconstruct it from memory. The angle of her smile, the way her hand blocked the sun, the house behind her that he later learned had been sold before he was old enough to ask questions about it. "This woman at the shelter," he said, "did she leave anything behind?" Brielle thought for a moment. "I'm not sure. The director would know. Her name is Tessa. She keeps track of everything." She reached into her apron pocket and wrote a name and address on the back of his receipt. "It's a small shelter. They open early on weekday mornings." Adrian folded the receipt and put it in his jacket pocket. He left cash on the table, more than enough. He picked up the photograph and looked at it one more time before sliding it back between the bills where it had lived for years. Outside, the night air was cool. Nolan called and he let it ring. He sat in the car for a long moment, hands on the wheel, going nowhere. His mother had been buried in a churchyard outside Nashville. He had visited the grave exactly once, 10 years after the funeral, and stood there, feeling nothing but a hollow kind of distance. Now, a woman in a roadside diner was telling him that someone who looked exactly like Evelyn Mercer had been sleeping in a shelter less than 40 miles away, carrying a photograph and a newspaper clipping with his family name on it. He started the car. There were two possible explanations. Either Brielle had seen someone who simply resembled his mother, a coincidence, a mistake, the kind of thing that happened when grief kept a face too alive in your memory, or something had been wrong for a very long time. He pulled out of the parking lot and drove toward Franklin. Adrian arrived at the shelter before it opened. He sat in the car across the street and watched the building come to life, slowly. Lights turning on room by room, a woman unlocking the front door, a delivery van dropping off boxes near the side entrance. The shelter operated out of a converted church hall on a quiet street in Franklin. The sign above the door read, "Grace Community Shelter," in simple painted letters. Nothing grand about it, just a building where people went when they had nowhere else to go. Nolan had called 4 more times by morning. Adrian finally answered on the drive over and gave him enough to stop the calls. The Nashville deal was dead. Move on. Handle the remaining paperwork. He said nothing about where he was going or why. Brielle was already inside when he walked in. She hadn't mentioned the night before that she'd be here this early, and for a brief moment, he wondered if she'd come specifically because she thought he would show up. She was arranging chairs near the far wall when she saw him. She didn't look surprised. "She usually handles intake," Brielle said, nodding toward a woman coming out of the back office. Tessa Holloway was somewhere in her late 50s, with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and the calm, organized energy of someone who had been managing difficult situations for a long time. She looked at Adrian the way shelter directors learn to look at people, measuring, careful, trying to figure out what kind of problem had just walked through her door. "Mr. Mercer," she said, after Brielle introduced him. "How can I help you?" He showed her the photograph. Tessa studied it for longer than he expected. She set it on the table between them, tilted her head slightly, then nodded once. "She came in on a Thursday," Tessa said. "Stayed 2 nights. She gave her name as Evelyn Brooks." Brooks? His grandmother's maiden name. He kept his face neutral. "What do you remember about her?" "Quiet, polite. She didn't ask for much. A bed, some soup, a place to sit and read. We get a lot of people passing through, and most of them need something urgently. She seemed like someone resting, rather than someone in crisis." Tessa paused. "She donated before she left. Cash, in an envelope, no name on it. But I know it was her, because she slipped it under my office door, early in the morning, before anyone was up. Did she say where she was going? No, and I didn't ask. People here share what they want to share. Adrian looked around the room. The folding chairs, the long tables, the bulletin board covered in community notices. A place designed to ask very little of the people it helped. She left something behind, Brielle said from across the room. Tessa glanced at her, then back at Adrian. She stood, went to the office, and came back carrying a small spiral notebook. The cover was plain blue. She set it on the table. Normally I'd hold this in case someone came back for it, Tessa said. But it's been a week, and something tells me this is exactly where it's supposed to end up. Adrian opened it carefully. The handwriting inside was small and precise, written with the kind of deliberate neatness that came from someone who had spent years being careful. Lists of dates, places, names he didn't recognize, but structured, purposeful, like a private record of a life lived in motion. Several pages had addresses written out in full. Some had been crossed out, others were circled. Near the middle of the notebook, one address was circled twice. A town near Bowling Green, Kentucky, a lakeside address. He turned another page and stopped. The handwriting on that page was different from the neat lists, looser, like it had been written quickly or written through emotion. It wasn't a list, it was a single line. He's done better than I ever hoped. No name, no context, just that one line, sitting alone on an otherwise blank page. Adrian closed the notebook. He sat with it for a moment, not speaking. Tessa watched him carefully. Brielle had stopped arranging chairs. "Can I take this?" he asked. Tessa considered it. "I can't officially give you someone else's belongings, but I also can't stop you from reading something that's sitting on a table in a common area." She picked up her coffee and walked back toward her office. "I'll be in the back for the next 10 minutes. Adrian took the notebook. Outside, he sat in the car and went through every page again, more slowly this time. The addresses formed a loose trail: Tennessee, Kentucky, North Carolina, Georgia. Some pages had small notes next to the addresses, names of churches, food banks, community programs, places that helped people, places that asked no questions. Brielle knocked on the passenger window. He unlocked the door, and she got in, which surprised him slightly. She didn't seem like someone who waited to be invited into things. "The handwriting," she said. "Is it hers?" He thought about the old family photo albums that had sat on a shelf in their house when he was young. His mother used to label every photograph on the back. Dates, names, small notes about the day. He hadn't thought about those albums in years. "I think so," he said. Brielle looked at the notebook in his hands. "What's in Kentucky?" An address circled twice. He looked up at the road ahead. "That usually means something." She nodded slowly. "Are you going?" "Yes." A pause. "I'd like to come," she said. "I know I have no reason to ask that. But I met her. She was kind to me. And I'd like to know she's all right." Adrian looked at her for a moment. People didn't usually ask him for things directly. They worked around it, built up to it, softened it with flattery first. He respected the directness. "We leave in an hour," he said. The drive to Kentucky took just over 2 hours. Brielle spent most of it looking out the window. She wasn't a talker, which Adrian appreciated. He'd half expected her to fill the silence with questions or conversation, the way most people did when they were nervous around him. Instead, she sat quietly, occasionally checking something on her phone, and left him alone with his thoughts. Nolan called once. Adrian let it go to voicemail. The address from the notebook led them off the main highway and onto a 2-lane road that curved along the edge of a lake. The water was visible through the trees, gray and still under an overcast sky. Small houses sat back from the road at intervals, Most of them the kind of modest lakeside properties that families had owned for generations. Boats tied to short docks, firewood stacked against porch railings. Nothing flashy, just quiet. The house they were looking for sat at the end of a gravel path, marked by a rusted mailbox with no name on it. Adrian pulled in slowly. From the outside it looked empty. No car in the driveway, no lights on inside, curtains drawn on the front windows. But the garden along the front path had been recently tended. No overgrown weeds, the soil turned over near a small row of plants that were just beginning to come up. Someone had been here recently enough to care about a garden. They got out of the car. Adrian tried the front door. Locked. He walked around the side of the house, checking windows. Brielle followed without being asked, which he was beginning to realize was simply how she operated. A window near the back was unlatched. He hesitated for only a moment before pushing it open. He wasn't proud of the habit, but certain skills stayed with a person regardless of how much they changed. Inside, the house was clean and ordered, not abandoned, lived in. There were dishes in the drying rack beside the sink, a folded blanket on the arm of a chair, a half-burned candle on the kitchen table. Whoever had been staying here had left in an unhurried way, taking time to tidy up before going. Adrian moved through the rooms slowly. The main bedroom had an empty wardrobe with a few wire hangers left inside. The bathroom had a single bar of soap and an empty shelf where toiletries had clearly sat until recently. Someone had packed deliberately, taking what they needed, leaving behind only what they didn't want to carry. Brielle called him from the small sitting room off the hallway. She was standing beside a low bookshelf that covered most of one wall. The books were an eclectic mix: paperback novels, a few books on gardening, some history, poetry. What had caught her attention was a stack of 3 hardcovers, pulled slightly away from the others, sitting at an angle as though they'd been taken out and replaced in a hurry. Adrian pulled the first one from the shelf. A slim volume of poetry, the spine cracked from regular reading. He flipped through it. Nothing. The second book was a travel guide, The American South. Several pages had their corners folded down. He set it aside. The third book was thicker, a hardcover novel with a plain green cover. He opened it, and a photograph fell out and landed on the floor between them. Brielle picked it up first. She looked at it for a moment, then held it out to him without a word. The photograph was in color, which was the first thing that struck him. Not old and faded, like the one in his wallet. This one was recent, the image sharp, the colors natural. It had been taken outdoors, in what looked like a small market or town square. The woman in it was standing beside a flower stall, looking slightly to the left of the camera, not quite posing. She was older, considerably older than the photograph he carried. Her hair was white, her face lined, but the angle of her head, the slight curve of her smile at something just out of frame. Adrian sat down on the arm of the nearest chair. He had been telling himself since the diner that there was likely a reasonable explanation, a resemblance, a coincidence, the mind finding patterns when grief left empty spaces. He had built a practical life on logic, and he trusted it. The logic was getting harder to hold on to. The woman in this photograph was not someone who resembled Evelyn Mercer. She was Evelyn Mercer. Brielle said nothing. She understood, he thought, that there was nothing useful to say. He turned the photograph over. On the back, written in the same small, precise handwriting from the notebook, was a single word and a date. The word was ready. The date was 4 months ago. Ready for what, he didn't know. He set the photograph down and went back to the bookshelf. Behind the row of books on the bottom shelf, pushed flat against the back wall, were several months of utility bills. Gas, electricity, water, all addressed to an E. Brooks at this address. The most recent bill was dated 6 weeks ago. The account had been closed, a final balance settled and paid. She had been living here, and 6 weeks ago she had chosen to leave. Adrian took the bills and the photograph and went back to the kitchen. He stood at the window looking out at the lake. The water was darker now, the sky pressing down on it. "She's not hiding from the world," Brielle said from the doorway. "She keeps helping people, donating money, volunteering. She's hiding from something specific." He had been thinking the same thing. "Or someone," he said. He pulled out the notebook and looked at the next circled address. Louisville, Kentucky. A name written beside it. 2 words. Colton Reeves. He didn't recognize it. But whoever Colton Reeves was, Evelyn had thought he was worth writing down. That was enough to go on. Louisville was 90 minutes from the lake house. Adrian drove, while Brielle searched the name Colton Reeves on her phone. What came back was thin. A LinkedIn profile that hadn't been updated in years. A brief mention in a local newspaper article about a private investigation firm that had closed down sometime in the early 2000s, and a residential address that may or may not still be current. No social media, no recent activity anywhere. The kind of digital footprint that belonged to someone who had deliberately kept themselves small. The address led them to a residential neighborhood in the eastern part of the city. Older homes, well kept. The kind of street where people had lived for decades and knew their neighbors by name. They parked in front of a brown brick house with a covered porch. A light was on inside. Adrian knocked. The man who answered the door was in his mid-70s, heavy-set, with sharp eyes that took in Adrian and Brielle in one quick sweep. He didn't open the door all the way. He stood in the gap, one hand on the frame, and said nothing. "Just waited. Colton Reeves," Adrian said. "It wasn't a question. Depends on who's asking. My name is Adrian Mercer." Something moved behind the old man's eyes, not quite recognition, more like the confirmation of something he'd been half expecting for a long time. He looked at Adrian for a long moment, then at Brielle, then back. "You'd better come in," he said. The house was orderly and plain. A sitting room with 2 armchairs and a couch. Bookshelves along one wall. A television that was turned off. Colton moved slowly, but without difficulty, the way men his age moved when they were still physically capable, but had stopped rushing at everything. He gestured toward the couch and lowered himself into the armchair across from it. "How did you find me?" he asked. "A notebook," Adrian said, "left behind at a shelter in Franklin, Tennessee." Colton looked at the ceiling briefly. Something between resignation and relief crossed his face. "She always said she was too careful. Turns out careful has limits." Adrian leaned forward. "You knew her." "I knew her," Colton said simply. He wasn't going to pretend otherwise, which Adrian respected. Adrian placed the recent photograph on the coffee table between them. Colton glanced at it, and the muscles around his jaw tightened slightly. "When did you take this?" he asked. "I didn't. I found it in a house in Kentucky. She left it behind." Colton picked it up and looked at it for a moment. His expression was difficult to read. Something fond underneath something careful. He set it back down. "How much do you know?" he asked. "Almost nothing," Adrian said. "I was told my mother died when I was 17. I attended the funeral. I have spent the last 20-something years believing that." He paused. "Now I'm sitting in your living room in Louisville with a photograph taken 4 months ago of a woman who should be in a grave outside Nashville. So I'd appreciate whatever you can tell me." Colton was quiet for a long moment. He looked at his hands, then out the window, then back at Adrian. "I spent 30 years as a private investigator," he said. "Before that, I worked in personal security. I was good at both because I understood one thing. Some people need to disappear. And when they do, the most important part of the job is making sure nobody finds them. He paused. I helped your mother disappear a long time ago. That's all I'll confirm. That's not enough, Adrian said. I know it isn't, but there are things I'm not able to tell you, and that boundary exists for reasons that still matter. He held Adrian's gaze steadily. What I can tell you is that the decision wasn't made lightly, and it wasn't made selfishly. Brielle spoke for the first time since they'd sat down. She left a notebook with addresses and records. That doesn't sound like someone who wanted to stay hidden forever. Colton looked at her with what seemed like mild surprise, as though he'd underestimated her. No, he said slowly. It doesn't. He stood and walked to the bookshelf. He ran his finger along the spines of several books before pulling out a plain manila envelope that had been sitting flat behind a row of paperbacks. He held it for a moment, turning it over in his hands. She sent me this 8 months ago, he said. No return address, postmarked from Asheville, North Carolina. Inside was a letter, and instructions that if anyone ever came to me with her photograph and the name Mercer, I should give them this. He held it out. Adrian took it. The envelope was sealed. His name was written on the front, in the same small handwriting from the notebook. Just Adrian, nothing else. He looked at it for a long moment without opening it. She planned this, he said quietly. She's been planning it for a while, I think, Colton said, sitting back down. She's been moving closer, leaving things behind on purpose. I think she wants to be found. She just needed to know that whoever found her was truly looking. Adrian opened the envelope. Inside was a single folded page. He read it slowly. Brielle didn't try to read over his shoulder. The letter didn't explain everything. It explained just enough, that she was safe, that she was sorry, and that if he had made it this far, then he deserved more than a letter. At the bottom, underlined once, was an address in Asheville, North Carolina, and below that, 4 words. Come alone. Please trust me. Adrian folded the letter carefully and put it in his jacket pocket. He picked up the photograph from the coffee table and stood. Thank you, he said to Colton. The old man nodded. She talked about you. More than you'd think. Adrian walked to the door. Brielle followed. At the threshold, he stopped without turning around. Was she scared? He asked. When you helped her leave. A pause. She was terrified, Colton said. But she never hesitated. Not for a single second. Adrian walked out into the evening air and didn't say anything for a long time. The letter said, Come alone. Adrian told Brielle over coffee the following morning. He expected an argument. Instead, she wrapped both hands around her mug and thought about it for a moment. Then go alone, she said, but follow the notebook first. The trail she left didn't start in Asheville. She built it piece by piece. If you skip straight to the end, you'll arrive with half the picture. He looked at her across the table. You think it matters, he said. I think she left a trail for a reason. Not just to lead you to her, but to show you something along the way. She set her mug down. If she just wanted you to find her, she would have written you a letter years ago. He didn't argue with that, because he couldn't. The notebook listed donations made under different names across several towns, a pattern that became clearer the more closely he studied it. Each donation was linked to a charitable organization. Each organization was small and community-based, and each one, when he called ahead and described the donor, remembered her immediately. That was the thing about Evelyn Mercer, or Evelyn Brooks, or whatever name she had been using. She left impressions on people, not through grand gestures, but through the quality of her attention. She remembered names. She showed up consistently. She made people feel that what they were doing mattered. The first stop was a food bank in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. The director, a younger woman named Carla, met them in a small back office crowded with donation boxes. She recognized the photograph immediately and smiled before Adrian even finished his sentence. "Oh, she volunteered here for almost 3 months. About 2 years ago," Carla said, "called herself Mary Ellison. She came every Saturday without fail, never late, never complained about anything." She paused, looking at the photograph fondly. "She used to bring homemade bread on the last Saturday of every month. People started asking about it by the 3rd week." Adrian asked if she had left anything behind. Carla thought for a moment, then went to a filing cabinet and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She left this when she moved on, said to keep it in case someone came asking. She handed it over. "We get people looking for family sometimes. We always keep notes." The paper had an address on it, not the Asheville address from the letter, a different one, a women's community center in Chattanooga. The trail was layered. She hadn't left one path. She had left several, each one feeding into the next. Chattanooga was 2 hours south. On the drive, Adrian found himself thinking about things he hadn't thought about in years. Small things. The way his mother folded napkins at the dinner table into neat triangles. The specific sound of her laugh. Quick and genuine. Never performed. The fact that she always kept a book on the kitchen counter and read a few pages while she waited for things to cook. He had locked those memories away a long time ago. Grief had required it. You couldn't build what he had built while looking backwards. Now the memories were returning on their own, quietly, without asking permission. The community center in Chattanooga was run by a woman named Ruth, who had been operating it out of the same building for over 20 years. She was in her 60s, direct, with the kind of warm efficiency that came from decades of doing meaningful work without enough resources. She remembered Evelyn clearly. "She helped us set up a literacy program," Ruth said, sitting across from them in her office. "Came to us and said she'd noticed we had the space, but not the structure. She organized the whole thing in 6 weeks, found volunteer tutors, created a schedule, designed the materials herself." Ruth shook her head slowly. "When she left, I asked her why she couldn't stay. She said she had a habit of moving on before she became too attached to things." Adrian absorbed that quietly. Ruth hadn't received a note or forwarding address, but she remembered something Evelyn had mentioned once in passing, that she had always wanted to live somewhere with mountains, and that she'd been spending time near Asheville. The pieces kept connecting. From Chattanooga, they drove northeast toward Asheville, stopping at a small arts funding organization in a town called Hendersonville that the notebook listed with a circled date from 18 months ago. The coordinator there, a soft-spoken man named Gerald, remembered a woman matching the description who had made an anonymous donation substantial enough to fund their youth program for an entire year. "She asked only one thing in return," Gerald said, "that we never try to find out who she was." He paused. "We didn't," he added, "but she came back once, about 6 months later, just to see how the program was going. She sat in the back of a class for about 20 minutes and then left without speaking to anyone. One of the kids drew a picture and left it on the chair where she'd been sitting." He smiled slightly. "I don't know if she took it or not." Adrian looked out the window at the mountains beginning to rise in the distance. He had spent his adult life building things through leverage and pressure and calculated risk. He had taken what he wanted from a world that respected that approach. He had told himself it was the only language the world understood. His mother had spent the same years moving quietly through that same world, leaving food banks and literacy programs and youth art funds in her wake, leaving people warmer than she found them. No leverage, no pressure, just showing up and doing something useful. He felt the distance between those two lives like a physical weight. Brielle hadn't said much for the last hour of driving. As they came into Asheville, she looked over at him. "You're thinking about her differently now," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," he said. She nodded and looked back at the road. "That's probably what she intended," she said quietly. The address from the letter led them to the edge of Asheville, not into the city itself, but past it, up a winding road that climbed through dense tree cover before leveling out into a small cluster of rental cabins set back from a mountain overlook. The kind of place people came to in autumn to see the leaves turn. Off-season now, most of the cabins sat empty, their small porches bare, their fire pits cold. The cabin at the end of the path was different. Smoke came from the chimney. A pair of boots sat beside the front door. A clay pot with something green growing in it had been placed on the porch railing, the kind of small domestic detail that turned a rented space into a temporary home. Adrian stopped the car and sat for a moment. "This is where you go alone," Brielle said. He looked at her. She said, "Come alone." Brielle said simply, "I'll wait here." He got out and walked up the path. The smoke from the chimney carried the smell of pine wood. He stood at the door for a moment before knocking. No answer. He tried the handle. It opened. Inside, the cabin was warm and quiet. A fire burned low in the stone fireplace. 2 armchairs faced it, one of them with a blanket draped over the back. A small kitchen to the left, clean and orderly. A table near the window with a lamp on, and a cup of tea that was still faintly steaming. She had been here minutes ago. He stepped inside and looked around. On the table beside the tea was a stack of notebooks. Not one, like the blue spiral notebook from the shelter, but several, maybe 8 or 10, varying sizes. Their covers worn with handling. They were arranged in order, from oldest to newest, which he could tell by the condition of the spines. The oldest ones were soft and faded. The most recent sat on top, its cover still clean. There was a note on top of the stack. "Read them. I'll be back before dark. E." He sat down at the table and opened the oldest journal. The handwriting inside was younger, the same small, precise style, but with less wear in it, the letters slightly rounder. The first entry was dated over 30 years ago. He did the math quickly. He would have been very young, 7 or 8 years old. He didn't read every word. He moved through the pages with the care of someone who understood they were holding something private, stopping at entries that seemed significant, reading those fully before moving on. The early entries were ordinary, daily life, observations, small moments. But within the first 30 pages, a different tone began to surface. Worry, written carefully around the edges of otherwise calm sentences. References to people she didn't name directly, using initials only. References to something she had witnessed inside a business network she had been connected to through her work at the time. Something that had frightened her badly enough that she had started writing in this journal instead of talking to anyone. He read those entries slowly. What emerged was a picture of a woman who had found herself in possession of information that powerful people wanted buried. She hadn't gone looking for it. She had stumbled across it in the course of ordinary work and then made the mistake of asking questions. When the questions drew attention she didn't want, a trusted friend, someone she never named, only called R, had come to her and told her plainly that staying visible was no longer safe. The decision to disappear had not been made over weeks. It had been made in 72 hours. Adrian set that journal down and picked up the next one. The entries in this volume were different, quieter, more reflective, written from a distance. She described the first years of her new life with a steadiness that surprised him. No self-pity, no bitterness in the language. What she wrote about most, in those early years, was him. She tracked everything she could find. Newspaper mentions, public records, anything that surfaced about the Mercer name. She wrote about each piece of information as though filing it carefully into a private record she intended to keep for the rest of her life. He's doing well. I can tell from the way his name appears. Not as a victim of anything, but as someone moving forward. That's all I ever wanted to see. He read that entry twice. The middle journals covered years of movement. The towns she had lived in, the people she had met, the small programs she had contributed to along the way. What became clear across those pages was that the helping wasn't accidental. It was intentional. She had lost the ability to build a permanent life of her own, so she had built pieces of other people's lives instead. A literacy program here, a food bank there, an anonymous donation to an arts fund in a small town where she spent 3 months one winter. She had not been hiding from life. She had been living a different version of it. The most recent journal was thinner than the others. Only a portion of it was filled. The entries were slower, more deliberate, like someone writing with the awareness that they were approaching something. The last entry was dated 2 weeks ago. I've been leaving pieces behind for months now. The notebook, the photograph, the addresses. I told myself I was being careful. But I think the truth is, I'm tired of being careful. I want him to find me. I want to sit across from my son and tell him that everything I did was because I loved him, and I didn't know another way. I hope he's not angry. I think I'd understand if he was. Adrian closed the journal. The fire had burned lower while he read. The tea on the table had gone cold. Outside, the light through the window had shifted. Late afternoon deepening toward early evening. He heard footsteps on the porch. The door opened. He stood up from the table and turned around. The woman in the doorway was older than every photograph he had carried or found. Her hair was fully white, her face deeply lined, her frame smaller than he remembered. She was carrying a paper bag of groceries in one arm and had stopped completely still in the doorway, looking at him. Neither of them spoke. She set the groceries down slowly on the floor, just inside the door, and her hands were trembling slightly as she let go of the bag. "Adrian," she said. Her voice was the same. That, above everything else, undid him. He crossed the room, and his mother held on to him with both arms, and neither of them said anything for a long time. They sat by the fire for 3 hours. Evelyn made fresh tea, and Adrian let her, understanding without being told that she needed something to do with her hands, while they found their footing with each other. She moved around the small kitchen with the quiet efficiency of someone who had lived alone for a long time, knowing exactly where everything was, needing no extra space, making no unnecessary movements. He watched her and said nothing until she sat down across from him. "I read the journals," he said. "I know. I left them for you. All of it. The business network, the witness, the 72 hours. I understood the broad shape of it." He paused. "But I want to hear it from you." She wrapped both hands around her mug and looked at the fire. When she spoke, her voice was steady, the way a voice got when something had been carried long enough that the weight of it became familiar. She had been working as an accounts manager for a logistics company in Nashville. Respectable work, decent salary, nothing remarkable about it. Until she discovered, through a series of financial records that crossed her desk in the wrong order on the wrong day, that the company was being used to move money for people who did very serious things. She hadn't understood it fully at first. She had asked her supervisor a question she shouldn't have asked. Within a week, 2 men had come to her home. They hadn't threatened her directly. They had been polite, which was worse. They told her that people who understood certain things about certain organizations had a simple choice: stay quiet inside the circle or disappear outside it. They gave her 3 days to decide. She had called R that same night. R had a contact, Colton Reeves. Within 72 hours, Evelyn Mercer was dead on paper, buried in a closed casket funeral, organized for a woman who had died of a heart condition. The body was real. The identity attached to it wasn't. It was the kind of arrangement that cost a significant amount of money and required the cooperation of exactly 3 people, none of whom ever discussed it publicly. Adrian listened without interrupting. The hardest part, Evelyn said, wasn't leaving. It was watching you go through that funeral and not being able to come to you. She looked down at her tea. You were 17. You stood so straight. I watched from a car across the road, and I told myself it was the last time I would ever do something that hurt you. You did it for 20 years after that, he said. The words came out quiet, without accusation, which surprised him. I know, she said. I told myself every year that it was almost safe enough, that soon I could come forward. She paused. But the people I was afraid of didn't go away quickly, and by the time they did, you had built something significant and visible, and I was terrified that surfacing would pull whatever was left of that old world back toward you. You could have trusted me to handle it, he said. You were my son, she said simply. I never stopped seeing you at 17, standing in the rain in that churchyard. You can't ask a mother to stop protecting someone from that image. He understood it. He didn't have to like it to understand it. They moved off the harder things after a while and found their way into smaller ones. The kind of conversation that happened between 2 people rebuilding something carefully. She asked about his life, the parts she hadn't been able to track through newspaper mentions and public records. He answered honestly, including the parts he wasn't proud of. She listened without judgment, which he hadn't fully expected. I know what business you've been in, she said at one point. I always knew. I watched it happen from a distance, and I prayed you'd eventually find your way to something better. A pause. I think you already started before you found me. He thought about that. He thought about the Nashville deal he had walked away from, about the calls from Nolan he had been ignoring, about how, somewhere between a roadside diner and a mountain cabin, the appetite he'd always had for that particular life had quietly shifted into something he couldn't quite name yet. Before he left that evening, Evelyn walked him to the door. I can't stay here much longer, she said. This cabin is rented through the end of the month. I've been thinking about settling somewhere properly, somewhere I can stop moving. Where? He asked. She smiled for the first time that evening, genuinely, the way he remembered. I've always wanted to live near the ocean, she said. I used to think that was a foolish dream. Too exposed, too open for someone trying to stay invisible. She looked past him at the mountains darkening in the last of the light. But I'm tired of invisible. He told her he would come back in 2 days. She nodded as though she had already assumed he would. Walking back to the car, he found Brielle sitting on the bonnet, arms folded, watching the tree line. She looked over when she heard him coming. She didn't ask how it went. She looked at his face and seemed to find the answer there. She's real, Brielle said. Yes, he said. They drove back down the mountain in the dark. Halfway into the descent, Brielle spoke. She's going to need somewhere to land properly, she said. She can't keep renting cabins. She mentioned the ocean, he said, somewhere near Savannah. Brielle nodded slowly. That's a good place. Quiet enough to settle. Warm most of the year. Good people. She paused. She'd do well there. Adrian kept his eyes on the road. He was already thinking about how to make it happen. 3 weeks passed before Adrian saw her again. He spent those weeks doing something he hadn't done in years, untangling. The Nashville operation had threads running in too many directions, obligations that couldn't be dropped overnight, arrangements that needed careful handling before he could step back from them cleanly. He worked through it methodically, without drama, closing doors that had been open too long. Nolan took it better than expected. He had always been perceptive in the way that loyal people sometimes were. sensing a shift before it was announced, adjusting without being asked. When Adrian told him the broad shape of what he was stepping back from, Nolan simply nodded and said he'd been wondering when it would happen. Adrian had found a small house near the Savannah waterfront. Not large, 3 rooms, a covered porch that faced a narrow street lined with oak trees, a short walk from the water. The neighborhood was quiet and established, the kind of place where people sat on their porches in the evening and waved at neighbors they'd known for decades. He had arranged the lease through a property manager, furnished it simply, and stocked the kitchen before Evelyn arrived. She had driven down from Asheville herself, which he had offered to prevent, and she had politely refused. She arrived on a Tuesday morning in a car that was older than it should have been, with 2 suitcases, a box of books, and the clay pot from the cabin porch. The green plant inside it, surviving the journey intact. He was waiting on the porch when she pulled up. She got out of the car and looked at the house for a moment, then at the oak trees, then at him. "It's perfect," she said. They carried her things inside together. It didn't take long. She traveled light, a habit of 30 years that wouldn't disappear overnight. Once everything was in, she moved through the rooms slowly, touching things lightly, opening the curtains in each room to let the light in. She placed the clay pot on the kitchen windowsill where the morning sun would reach it. Adrian made coffee while she settled in. They sat at the kitchen table and she told him about the drive. A small detour she had taken through a town in South Carolina she had lived in briefly years ago, just to see it again. It had changed considerably. She had sat in a parking lot for 20 minutes, looking at a building that used to be a bakery and was now something else entirely. "I think I needed to see that," she said. "That the places I left didn't freeze in time waiting for me. They kept going. Everyone kept going. So did you," he said. She looked at him with an expression he remembered from childhood. The one she used when he said something that surprised her, in a good way. They talked for most of the afternoon. The conversation moved differently than it had in the cabin, looser, less weighted, ranging across things that had nothing to do with the past. She asked about Brielle in a way that suggested she had already formed an opinion she wasn't stating directly. He told her that Brielle had gone back to her life in Franklin, back to the diner and the weekend volunteering, and that he had spoken to her twice since Asheville. Evelyn nodded and said nothing, which said quite a lot. As the afternoon moved toward evening, she took him to the waterfront herself, having already walked the neighborhood that morning while he was parking the car. She knew which way to go without checking her phone, pointing out things she had already noticed. A bookstore 2 streets over that she intended to visit, a small garden behind a church that had caught her eye, a coffee cart near the water that opened early. She was already building a life here. She had been doing it since the morning she arrived. They walked along the waterfront as the sun dropped lower. The water was calm, reflecting the last of the light in long, flat strips. Other people walked the same path, couples, families, a man throwing a ball for a dog that never seemed to tire of retrieving it. Evelyn stopped at a bench, and they sat. "I kept everything," she said after a while. "Every article I could find with your name in it. Every mention in any publication I could access. I have folders going back 20 years. She paused. "I know that might seem strange." "It doesn't," he said. "There were years when the articles worried me," she said honestly. "The direction things seemed to be going. I used to sit with a newspaper and argue with it, which is a fairly pointless activity." He smiled at that. "Did you win?" "Never. Newspapers are very stubborn." She looked at the water. "But lately, in the past year or 2, the tone of what I was reading started to change. Quieter, less of a certain kind of story, and more of nothing, which, in your particular case, I decided to take as a good sign." He thought about how much she had understood from a distance. With incomplete information, reading between lines she couldn't fully see. "I'm sorry," he said, "for the years of articles that worried you." She turned and looked at him directly. "I'm not interested in apologies for the past. I'm interested in what comes next." She held his gaze. "What comes next, Adrian?" He had been thinking about that question for 3 weeks. "Something better," he said. "I don't have a cleaner answer than that yet." She nodded slowly. "Something better is enough to start with." The sun finished setting while they sat there. The waterfront lights came on, one by one, reflecting in the water below. She reached over and put her hand over his, the way she had when he was small, and the world felt too large for him, and he let himself sit inside that moment without pulling away from it. For the first time in a very long time, he wasn't in a hurry to be anywhere else. 6 weeks after Evelyn moved into the Savannah house, Adrian sold his stake in the Nashville operation. It wasn't a dramatic exit. There were no ultimatums, no burned bridges, no moment designed to feel significant. He simply worked through the remaining obligations, transferred his interests to the people who had always wanted them, and walked away from something he had spent 15 years building with less ceremony than he had expected to feel. The morning after the final paperwork was signed, he sat on the porch of a hotel 2 streets from Evelyn's house and drank coffee that was considerably better than the cup that had started everything, and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not relief exactly, more like the particular quiet that settles in when a noise you've stopped noticing finally goes away. Nolan had already moved on, a consultant role with a legitimate logistics firm, something he had been quietly interested in for years. He texted Adrian on the day the deal closed. "About time." Adrian sent back a single thumbs up and meant it genuinely. The Nashville chapter was done. What came next assembled itself more gradually than Adrian had expected, without a grand plan behind it. He had imagined that stepping back from one life would immediately reveal the shape of another. Instead, it arrived in pieces, through small decisions made one at a time. The first piece came through Evelyn. She had started volunteering at the bookstore 2 streets from her house within her first week in Savannah. By the 3rd week, she was organizing a reading group for elderly residents at a nearby community center, the same careful, quiet competence she had carried through 30 years of moving. The woman running the community center mentioned to Evelyn that their after-school tutoring program had lost its funding and would likely close before the end of term. Evelyn mentioned it to Adrian over dinner one evening, carefully, without making it a request. He looked into it the following morning. The funding gap was modest by any standard he was used to operating at. He covered it before lunch and asked that his name be kept off the documentation. The community center director called Evelyn to say an anonymous donor had come through. Evelyn called Adrian that evening and said nothing about it directly. "The tutoring program is saved," she said. "Good," he said. A pause. "They also mentioned the roof leaks," she said. He laughed for the first time in what felt like months. It came out rusty, but genuine. The roof was fixed by the end of the following week. That was the first piece. Others followed in their own time. A literacy initiative in a Franklin neighborhood that Brielle had mentioned in passing during one of their phone calls. A small arts fund in Hendersonville that Adrian remembered from the notebook trail, which turned out to still be operating, but barely. A community kitchen in Chattanooga that Ruth had built alongside her women's center and was struggling to keep staffed. He didn't announce any of it. He didn't build a foundation or put his name on anything. He simply paid attention to what Evelyn's trail had shown him and directed resources toward the places that were already doing good work and needed room to breathe. It wasn't a transformation. He was clear-eyed enough not to dress it up as one. He was a man with money and a complicated history, choosing to use that money differently. The history didn't disappear because the choices changed, But the choices still mattered, and he made them. Brielle came to Savannah on a Saturday, in late autumn. She had driven down from Franklin without making a large occasion of it, 3 hours each way, arriving mid-morning, carrying a tin of something she had baked the previous night, and a slightly battered paperback she wanted to return to Evelyn, who had lent it to her during a brief visit to Nashville 3 weeks earlier. The two of them had developed a friendship that Adrian had watched form with quiet surprise, as though he hadn't quite seen it coming, despite every sign pointing toward it. Evelyn had organized a small gathering at the house that afternoon. Small, genuinely. 4 people, including the community center director and a neighbor who had become a regular at the reading group. She had cooked, which Adrian had learned was her primary way of expressing contentment. When Evelyn Mercer was happy with where she was, she fed people. Adrian stood in the kitchen doorway, watching her and Brielle talking over the counter, Brielle laughing at something, Evelyn's expression carrying that particular warm amusement she had when she was enjoying someone's company thoroughly. He stepped out onto the porch. The afternoon was mild, the oak trees along the street holding their last leaves, the light coming through at the long, low angle it reached in late autumn. He could hear the water from where he stood, just far enough away to be a sound rather than a sight. He thought about the diner outside Nashville, the bad coffee, the photograph sliding across the table, a woman he had never met, stopping to say something that turned his entire understanding of his own life upside down. He thought about what Colton had said, sitting in that Louisville living room. She was terrified, but she never hesitated. He understood that better now than he had in the moment. He had spent most of his adult life operating from a position of control, knowing the angles, managing the outcomes, staying ahead of whatever was coming. His mother had operated from a position of love, which was considerably less controlled and considerably more costly. She had paid that cost for 30 years without complaint. He owed her more than a fixed roof and a house near the ocean. He owed her the version of himself she had imagined when she stood at a distance and argued with newspapers. He was working on it. The front door opened behind him, and Evelyn came out onto the porch, carrying 2 cups of coffee. She handed him one and stood beside him, looking at the street. "Brielle is staying for dinner," she said. "I assumed she would be," he said. Evelyn smiled and leaned against the porch railing. "She's good for you." He didn't answer that directly, which was an answer in itself. They stood together in the late afternoon light, his mother beside him, the street quiet, the water somewhere nearby, the oak trees dropping their last leaves one at a time onto the pavement below. He had spent 20 years building things from grief. Now he was building something from something else entirely. He wasn't sure yet what to call it, but it felt, for the first time in a long time, like the right material to build with.